On the morning of September 12, 1987, 14 men were systematically hunted and eliminated across the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky over a span of 96 hours. All adults, all connected to a single moonshine operation that had been running whiskey through Breathitt County for over 3 decades. The method was precise, calculated, methodical. Rifle shots from concealed positions, ambushes on dark mountain roads, fires that consumed entire cabins with families sleeping inside. The perpetrators weren't federal agents or rival gangs from neighboring counties. They were 5 members of the Turner clan, a patriarch and his 4 sons, moving through the Cumberland Mountains like phantoms, erasing everyone who knew their secret. The FBI would later call it the most systematic family elimination in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't territory, wasn't a drug war, wasn't even revenge for violence done. It was theft, the theft of something more precious than money in these forgotten mountains. A moonshine still that had been in the Turner family for 4 generations, stolen by men they'd once called neighbors. Men they'd trusted with their lives, their secrets, their livelihood. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that shattered an entire community and left scars that remain visible today. Breathitt County, Kentucky wasn't much more than a collection of weathered houses scattered across impossible terrain in the fall of 1987. Population barely 8,000 souls spread across 400 square miles of mountains so steep you couldn't see your neighbor's smoke unless you climbed to the ridgeline. The nearest real town, Jackson, sat 23 miles south on roads that turned to muddy rivers when autumn rains came early. Most folks in Breathitt County had never been farther than Lexington, 90 miles northwest on highways that wound through mountains like serpents following ancient creek beds. September in eastern Kentucky meant mornings dropping to 52 degrees, afternoons climbing to maybe 75 if the sun could penetrate the fog that clung to these hollows like cigarette smoke in a closed room. The air carried the smell of wood fires from coal stoves, rotting leaves beginning their slow return to earth, and that sharp metallic scent of approaching winter that mountain people learned to read like scripture. You could hear these mountains breathing, wind moving through stands of hickory and oak that had stood longer than any human memory, distant chainsaws cutting firewood for the long months ahead, sometimes the rumble of coal trucks grinding up impossible grades, their engines screaming in protest. But 1987 was a dying year in eastern Kentucky. The coal industry that had sustained these mountains for over a century was collapsing under the weight of mechanization and environmental regulations that treated mountain people like expendable statistics. Mine after mine had closed, leaving behind poisoned streams and families with no way to make a living. In Breathitt County, unemployment had reached 43% that September. Men who'd spent their entire lives believing that hard work in dangerous places guaranteed survival found themselves watching an economy that no longer needed their hands, their backs, their willingness to descend into darkness for wages that barely fed their families. In places this isolated, moonshine wasn't just business. It was survival, culture, identity. It was the economic backbone that had kept mountain families alive through the Great Depression, through 2 world wars, through every economic catastrophe the 20th century had thrown at rural America. Federal taxes on legal liquor made store-bought whiskey a luxury these people couldn't afford. So they made their own, following recipes and techniques passed down through generations of Scots-Irish immigrants who'd brought their knowledge from the old country 2 centuries before. The law called it illegal. The mountains called it tradition. And in 1987, with no other work available, moonshining was often the only thing standing between feeding your children and watching them go hungry. Ezekiel Turner was 61 years old that September, though the mountains had aged him beyond his years. He stood 6 feet 2 inches, lean and ropey with muscle built from decades of hard labor in places where machines couldn't go. His face was carved from leather and granite, deep lines etched around pale blue eyes that missed nothing. A scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, a souvenir from Korea where he'd carried a rifle through frozen hell and come home with medals he kept in a drawer and nightmares he'd never discussed with anyone. His hands told the story of his life. Knuckles swollen from breaks that had healed crooked. Fingertips stained permanent black from years of handling charcoal and copper. Calluses thick as boot leather from work that would have broken younger men. When Ezekiel shook your hand, you felt not just strength, but something deeper. A connection to these mountains that went back generations. A knowledge earned through blood and sweat, and choices that left no room for weakness. Every morning, Ezekiel woke at 4:30 in the house his grandfather had built in 1923, made coffee in a percolator older than his oldest son, and sat at the kitchen table smoking hand-rolled cigarettes while he planned his day. He didn't speak during these early hours, just sat in the darkness, drinking coffee that could strip paint, thinking thoughts he shared with no one. By 5:30, he'd be walking the trails only his family knew, checking the still hidden 3 miles back in the woods, following paths worn smooth by 4 generations of Turner men. He'd married Sarah Beth Combs in 1951, right after he came home from Korea with shrapnel in his left leg and a Purple Heart he never wore. They'd had 4 sons. Daniel was 34 now, back from Vietnam with his own collection of scars and silences. Matthew was 32, quieter than his older brother, but just as capable when capability mattered. Luke was 29, the thoughtful one who read books and asked questions that sometimes made Ezekiel uncomfortable. And Mark was 26, the youngest, still trying to prove he belonged among men who'd seen things he couldn't imagine. Sarah Beth was 58, her hands as work-worn as Ezekiel's, her face still beautiful despite everything these mountains had demanded from her. She'd buried 2 babies in the family cemetery on the ridge, had nursed all 4 of her surviving sons through childhood illnesses that would have been nothing in towns with doctors, had held the family together through Ezekiel's nightmares and drinking and the long silences that followed him home from war. What Ezekiel valued most wasn't money, though the Turner family had never had much of that anyway. What he valued was legacy, continuity, the unbroken chain that connected him to ancestors who'd walked these same ridges when Kentucky was still wilderness. His great-grandfather Josiah Turner had built the first still in 1895, learning the craft from his own father who'd brought the knowledge from Scotland. That still had fed the Turner family through the Depression, through wars, through every economic catastrophe that had swept across rural America like plague. The Turner still wasn't just equipment. It was inheritance, identity, the physical manifestation of knowledge passed down through 4 generations of men who'd understood that survival in these mountains required skills the outside world had forgotten. The location was secret, known only to Turner men, and guarded with a jealousy that bordered on religious devotion. The techniques were precise, refined over decades of experimentation, until the Turner family produced whiskey that was sought after in 3 counties. But more than that, the still represented something intangible but essential: respect, independence. The knowledge that no matter how bad times got, no matter what the government did or didn't do, the Turner family could take care of their own, could feed their children, pay their bills, maintain their dignity in a world that seemed determined to strip both dignity and livelihood from mountain people. In August 1987, that inheritance was stolen. The Hackett family had been neighbours to the Turners for over 40 years. Not close neighbours, nobody was close in these mountains, but neighbours in the way mountain people understood the term. Close enough to help during emergencies, far enough away to mind their own business. Earl Hackett was 57 that summer, a man who'd worked coal mines until black lung forced him to find other ways to make a living. He had 3 sons of his own and a reputation for being solid, reliable, the kind of man you could trust with secrets and money and your family's safety. For 15 years, Earl Hackett had bought whiskey from the Turner family, not competing, not trying to learn their methods, just buying quality product to sell in neighbouring counties where he had connections the Turners didn't possess. It was a partnership that worked for both families, built on handshake agreements and mountain honour that was stronger than any contract written in distant courthouses. But Earl Hackett's sons were hungry, ambitious in ways their father wasn't. The coal mines that had employed their father were closed now, the jobs gone forever, and they watched the Turner family make money from whiskey while they struggled to feed their own children. Wesley Hackett was 31, His brother James was 29, and their youngest brother Robert was 26. 3 men in their prime with no work available, no future visible, and a growing resentment toward neighbors who seemed to have found solutions to problems that were destroying the Hackett family. On August 15th, 1987, a Saturday when the temperature climbed to 94 degrees and the humidity made breathing feel like drowning, Wesley Hackett made a decision that would cost 14 men their lives. He followed Daniel Turner to the family still, stayed hidden in the tree line for 3 hours, memorized everything he saw, and went home with knowledge that didn't belong to him. The still itself sat in a clearing 3 miles from any road, hidden in a hollow so remote that even experienced hunters rarely stumbled across it. 4 generations of Turner men had carved this operation from wilderness, building something that was part workshop, part shrine to the old ways of mountain survival. The main still was a work of art, 200 gallons of hand-hammered copper that Josiah Turner had crafted himself in 1895, its surface worn smooth by decades of careful hands. Steam coils wound through oak barrels that had been seasoned for years, creating a system so precise that every batch produced whiskey with the exact flavor profile that had made Turner Moonshine legendary across eastern Kentucky. But it wasn't just the equipment that made the Turner operation valuable. It was the knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of 4 generations who'd perfected every detail. The exact temperature for fermentation, the precise timing for distillation, the secret blend of corn varieties that created their distinctive taste. Most importantly, the location itself, a water source so pure and consistent that it had never run dry, even during the worst droughts in living memory. This wasn't something you could relocate or rebuild. This was irreplaceable heritage, carved from these mountains through decades of dangerous, illegal work. Wesley Hackett understood this as he crouched in the tree line that August afternoon, watching Daniel Turner tend the still with the careful attention of a man handling something sacred. Wesley saw the copper gleaming in filtered sunlight, saw the steam rising from fermentation barrels, saw money, opportunity, and a solution to his family's desperate situation. But what he also saw, what he couldn't have understood without being raised in the Turner tradition, was that he was looking at something that couldn't be stolen without destroying it. The knowledge Wesley gained that day wasn't complete. He saw the equipment, memorized the layout, noted the water source and access routes, but he missed the subtle details that made the difference between producing quality whiskey and creating poison. He didn't understand the timing, the temperatures, the precise measurements that had been refined over generations. Most critically, he didn't comprehend that the Turner still wasn't just a business. It was identity, family honor, the physical manifestation of everything the Turner clan had built in these mountains. 3 weeks later, on September 7th, Ezekiel Turner climbed the familiar trail to his family's still and found nothing but bare earth where 200 gallons of irreplaceable copper had stood for 92 years. The fermentation barrels were gone. The steam coils had been cut and hauled away. Even the stone foundation that Josiah Turner had built by hand had been dismantled, the rocks scattered, as if the still had never existed. Ezekiel stood in that empty clearing for 20 minutes, not moving, not speaking, just absorbing the magnitude of what had been taken. This wasn't theft in any ordinary sense. This was the destruction of his family's identity, the severing of a connection that stretched back 4 generations. Without the still, the Turner family had no income, no legacy to pass to future generations, no way to maintain their independence in mountains that offered few alternatives for survival. But worse than the economic impact was the violation of trust, the betrayal of codes that held mountain communities together. Someone had followed his son Daniel, had violated the sacred secrecy that protected not just the Turner family, but the entire network of people who depended on their operation. Someone had taken knowledge that wasn't theirs to take and used it to destroy something that couldn't be replaced. When Ezekiel finally walked home that evening, moving like a man carrying invisible weight, he found his 4 sons waiting in the kitchen. Daniel, Matthew, Luke, and Mark sat around the table where 4 generations of Turner men had made decisions that shaped their family's destiny. Sarah Beth stood in the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She could see it in her husband's eyes, in the way his shoulders had sagged, in the terrible stillness that had settled over him. "The still is gone," Ezekiel said. His voice was quiet, controlled, but underneath the calm was something his family had never heard before. Not anger, something colder, more dangerous. Everything. Copper, barrels, pipes, even the foundation stones. Somebody knew exactly what they were taking and how to take it. Daniel, the oldest, spoke first. Who would know how to find it? Only family knew the location. "We never told nobody, never brought nobody up there except us." "Somebody followed you," Matthew said. "Had to be. No other way they could have found it." Luke, always the thoughtful one, asked the question that was eating at all of them. "Who's got the equipment to move 200 gallons of copper without being seen? Who's got the connections to sell it without word getting back to us?" Ezekiel looked at his youngest son, Mark, saw the anger building in the boy's eyes, saw the same rage that had driven Turner men to violence in generations past. But this required more than rage. This required planning, patience, the kind of methodical thinking that had built their operation in the first place. Over the next 3 days, the Turner family conducted their investigation with the same careful attention they'd applied to moonshining. They asked quiet questions, followed subtle leads, listened to conversations in places where mountain people gathered to share information without attracting outside attention. What they discovered was worse than simple theft. The Hackett family hadn't just stolen the Turner still. They'd moved it to their own property, reassembled it with modifications that showed they understood exactly what they'd taken. Wesley, James, and Robert Hackett were already producing whiskey, selling it to buyers who'd previously purchased from the Turners, using equipment that represented 4 generations of Turner family heritage. They weren't trying to hide their theft. They were flaunting it, treating the Turner still as if it had always belonged to them. But the betrayal went deeper than the Hackett brothers. The Turner family learned that 11 other men had helped with the theft, had provided transportation, labor, and local knowledge necessary to dismantle and relocate such a complex operation. Some were relatives of the Hacketts. Others were neighbors who'd grown resentful of Turner's success during hard times. A few were simply opportunists who'd seen a chance to profit from someone else's misfortune. 14 men total had conspired to destroy everything the Turner family had built. 14 men who'd known exactly what they were stealing and had chosen to do it anyway, violating codes of mountain honor that stretched back to the earliest settlements in Kentucky. 14 men who'd calculated that the Turner family was too small, too isolated, too dependent on secrecy to fight back effectively. They were wrong about Ezekiel Turner's willingness to fight back. They were catastrophically wrong about what he was capable of when everything he'd inherited from his ancestors was threatened. And they had no idea that their theft had awakened something in the Turner family that had been sleeping since the Korean War, when Ezekiel had learned that some problems could only be solved through violence so complete it eliminated the possibility of future challenges. On the evening of September 11th, 1987, Ezekiel called his 4 sons into the kitchen one final time. They sat around the same table where his father had taught him the moonshine business, where his grandfather had planned the construction of the original still, where generations of Turner men had made decisions that determined their family's survival in these unforgiving mountains. "What we're about to do," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "can't be undone. Once we start down this path, there's no going back. No forgiveness, no second chances. They stole our heritage, our livelihood, our future. But more than that, they broke the code that holds these mountains together. They proved they can't be trusted, can't be reasoned with, can't be allowed to prosper from what they took from us." The Turner family was about to cross a line that would transform them from victims of theft into something far more dangerous. They were about to become hunters, moving through these mountains with purpose that would leave 14 men dead and a community forever changed by violence born from betrayal too complete to forgive. The weapons came from places mountain people knew how to find them. Ezekiel's Service 45 from Korea, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden behind loose boards in the basement. A Winchester Model 70 that had belonged to his father, scope mounted for hunting deer on ridges where shots might stretch 300 yards, 2 shotguns, 12 gauge, reliable as sunrise for close work in heavy timber. Daniel contributed a Remington 700 he'd carried in Vietnam, a rifle that had saved his life more than once in jungles half a world away from these Kentucky mountains. But 4 weapons weren't enough for what the Turner family was planning. On September 10th, Ezekiel drove his 1973 Ford pickup to a farm outside Hazard, 30 miles south through mountain roads that twisted like ribbon dropped from heaven. The man he visited was named Thomas Begley, 68 years old, had done time in federal prison for firearms violations back in the 70s, but had maintained connections that federal agents either couldn't penetrate or chose to ignore. Thomas, Ezekiel said, standing in a barn that smelled like hay and gun oil and decades of careful secrecy. I need to borrow some equipment. Hunting season's coming early this year. Thomas studied Ezekiel's face, saw something there that required no explanation. How many hunters you expecting to encounter? About 14, give or take. Thomas disappeared into the back of the barn, returned 15 minutes later with 3 rifles wrapped in canvas and a box of ammunition that would have armed a small platoon. 2 more Winchester Model 70s with scopes that could reach targets at distances measured in heartbeats rather than yards. 1 Ruger Mini 14, semi-automatic, designed for situations where accuracy mattered less than volume of fire. The ammunition was military surplus, full metal jacket rounds that would punch through anything short of steel plate. These need to come back clean, Thomas said. No serial numbers filed, no modifications that would connect them to this conversation. You never saw me, I never saw you. Understood, Ezekiel replied. Anything happens, you were never involved. They shook hands in that barn, 2 old men who'd learned hard lessons about survival during wars that had taught them the value of preparation and the cost of being unprepared. Ezekiel loaded the weapons into his truck, drove home through mountains that would soon echo with violence planned in kitchens and executed on ridges where no one would hear the shots. The Turner family spent September 11th planning with military precision. Ezekiel spread topographical maps across the kitchen table, maps that showed every hollow, every ridge, every trail that connected the scattered properties where their targets lived. Daniel contributed tactical knowledge learned in Vietnamese jungles, understanding of ambush positions and fields of fire that translated perfectly to Kentucky mountains. Matthew provided local intelligence, knowledge of routines and habits gathered through years of living in a community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Luke, the thoughtful one, raised questions that needed answers. How do we make sure we get all 14? What happens if one of them runs, gets to the law before we finish? We don't give them time to run, Ezekiel said. We hit all of them in one night, fast and clean. No witnesses, no survivors, no one left to tell stories that could hurt us. Mark, the youngest, asked the question that was eating at all of them. What about their families? Women, children who didn't have nothing to do with stealing our still. We're not animals, Ezekiel said firmly. Women and children don't get hurt. That's not who we are. But the men who stole from us, who betrayed the code that keeps these mountains civilized, they've made their choice. Now, they live with the consequences. The plan they developed was methodical, comprehensive, designed to eliminate 14 targets across 6 different locations in a single night. 3 of the Hackett brothers lived together on the family property where they'd moved the stolen still. 2 cousins, Billy and Frank Hackett, had houses within a half-mile of each other near the mouth of Caney Creek. The other conspirators were scattered across hollows and ridges, some living alone, others with families who would complicate the work ahead. Daniel would take the Hackett property, the most dangerous target because 3 men would be there and they'd be armed, alert, expecting trouble eventually. Matthew and Luke would work together, hitting the scattered targets on the eastern side of the county where the terrain favored long-range shooting and quick escapes. Mark would handle the 2 cousins near Caney Creek, close quarters work that required steady nerves and quick hands. Ezekiel would coordinate, moving between positions to provide support where needed and ensure no one escaped the net they were weaving. The timing had to be perfect. September 12th was a Saturday night when mountain men traditionally gathered to drink and plan the coming week. Their targets would be relaxed, off guard, thinking about everything except the possibility that the Turner family had decided to take back what was stolen and eliminate everyone who'd participated in the theft. Sarah Beth Turner listened to her husband and sons plan mass murder in her kitchen. The same kitchen where she'd raised 4 boys, where she'd cooked thousands of meals, where she'd held her family together through decades of hardship that would have broken weaker people. She didn't speak, didn't object, didn't try to talk them out of what they were planning. Mountain women understood codes as clearly as mountain men, and the code said that some violations couldn't be forgiven, some theft couldn't be allowed to stand. But she also understood that what her family was about to do would change them forever, would transform them from people who'd never deliberately hurt anyone into something else entirely. She looked at Mark, her youngest, saw the boy who'd once cried over wounded birds, who'd refused to hunt deer because he couldn't stand the thought of causing pain to innocent creatures. Tomorrow night, that boy would become a killer, and there would be no going back. "You sure about this?" she said finally. Not a question, just a statement that gave her family one last chance to choose a different path. "They stole our heritage," Ezekiel replied. "Destroyed 4 generations of Turner family work. Broke codes that hold these mountains together. If we let this stand, we lose everything. Our respect, our livelihood, our ability to protect what's ours." Sarah Beth nodded slowly. "Then you do what needs doing. But you remember that once you cross this line, you can't uncross it. You'll carry this weight for the rest of your lives." The Turner family understood the weight they were about to carry. They'd calculated the cost and decided it was worth paying to preserve something more valuable than their own comfort, their own peace of mind. They were about to sacrifice their innocence to protect their identity, their heritage, their right to exist as independent people in mountains that offered few alternatives to submission or violence. At 11:30 on the night of September 11th, 1987, Ezekiel Turner walked through his house one final time, checking doors, windows, making sure everything was secure for Sarah Beth's protection, while her husband and sons were away doing work that couldn't be undone. He paused in the bedroom he'd shared with his wife for 36 years, looked at photographs on the dresser that showed 4 generations of Turner men, all of them honest, hard-working people who'd built something valuable in these unforgiving mountains. Tomorrow, those photographs would show a family of killers. But tonight, they still showed people who'd been pushed too far by neighbors, who'd mistaken patience for weakness, who'd calculated that theft could be accomplished without consequence. The Hackett family and their conspirators were about to learn that some mountain families, when threatened with complete destruction, would choose violence over submission, would prefer to become monsters rather than accept the loss of everything their ancestors had died to protect. Ezekiel picked up his rifle, checked the scope one final time, and walked out into the September darkness, where his 4 sons waited with weapons and determination, and the terrible knowledge that by dawn 14 men would be dead, and the Turner family would have crossed a line that separated civilized people from something far more dangerous. The mountains held their breath, waiting for violence that had been building since the day 4 generations of Turner family heritage disappeared from a hidden hollow 3 miles from any road. Justice was coming to Breathitt County, the old kind of justice that predated courts and laws and government, the kind that flowed from mountain codes written in blood and enforced by men who'd learned that sometimes civilization's rules didn't reach far enough to protect what mattered most. The first shot was fired at 11:47 p.m. on Saturday, September 12th, 1987. Temperature had dropped to 59 degrees, but the humidity made the mountain air feel thick enough to swim through. Clouds moved across a crescent moon like dark fingers reaching for something they couldn't quite grasp. The Cumberland Mountains sat silent in that particular way they get in deep autumn, when most creatures have found shelter and the wind dies to nothing more than whisper through pine needles. Daniel Turner lay prone on a ridge overlooking the Hackett family property, scope focused on the main house where warm yellow light spilled from kitchen windows. Through the crosshairs, he could see Wesley Hackett sitting at a table, beer in hand, laughing at something his brother James had said. Robert Hackett moved in and out of view, restless, pacing the kitchen like a man who sensed trouble coming but couldn't identify its source. The stolen Turner still sat 50 yards behind the house, reassembled under a lean-to shelter that provided protection from rain but no concealment from eyes that knew what to look for. Daniel could see copper gleaming in moonlight, could see the fermentation barrels his great-grandfather had crafted by hand, could see steam rising from equipment that represented everything his family had built over 4 generations. The sight of it filled him with cold rage that settled in his chest like winter air. Matthew and Luke Turner moved through darkness 2 miles east, following deer trails worn smooth by decades of animals seeking water. Their targets lived in separate cabins connected by a dirt road that became impassable mud when heavy rains came. Both men were asleep, trusting in isolation and mountain silence to protect them from consequences they'd never seriously considered. Mountain people slept soundly when they believed their neighbors followed the old codes of honor and mutual respect. Mark Turner crouched behind a fallen oak tree 100 yards from the Caney Creek Bridge, where Billy and Frank Hackett had built houses within shouting distance of each other. At 26, Mark was the youngest Turner son, the one who'd grown up hearing stories about family heritage without fully understanding what that heritage might cost to protect. Tonight, he was learning that some lessons can only be taught through blood. Ezekiel Turner sat in his pickup truck on a logging road that provided oversight of the entire operation, radio crackling softly with reports from his sons. The radio was military surplus, frequencies that wouldn't be monitored by anyone with authority to interfere. In Vietnam, Daniel had learned the value of communication, coordination, the difference between successful operations and disasters that left good men dead in foreign jungles. All positions confirmed, Daniel's voice came through the static. Targets in sight, waiting for go signal. Eastern Ridge secured, Matthew reported. 2 targets asleep, clean shots available. Caney Creek Bridge, Mark's voice, younger than his brother's, carrying tension he couldn't quite hide. Ready when you are. Ezekiel looked at his watch. 11:46 p.m. In 1 minute, the Turner family would cross a line that separated them from everything they'd been before this night. In 1 minute, they would become killers, hunters, people who solved problems through violence so complete it eliminated any possibility of future challenges. Execute, Ezekiel said into the radio. The shot from Daniel's rifle cut through mountain silence like thunder breaking over distant ridges. Wesley Hackett's head snapped back, beer bottle falling from nerveless fingers to shatter on kitchen linoleum. James Hackett had time to register his brother's death, time to understand what was happening, time to reach for the shotgun leaning against the wall before Daniel's second shot dropped him beside the table where they'd been celebrating their success as moonshine thieves. Robert Hackett ran, burst through the kitchen door into September darkness, screaming for help that wouldn't come, running toward trees that might provide cover from death that had found his family. Daniel tracked him through the scope, led his target by the distance a man could cover in the time it takes a bullet to travel 300 yards, squeezed the trigger with the same mechanical precision he'd learned in jungles where hesitation meant death. Robert Hackett fell 30 yards from safety, face down in mud that would drink his blood before dawn revealed what the Turner family had done to protect their heritage. 2 miles east, Matthew and Luke Turner approached their targets with patience learned through years of hunting deer that would bolt at the first hint of danger. The first cabin sat dark and silent, smoke rising from a chimney that meant warmth inside, comfort, the kind of peace that comes from believing your neighbors respect the codes that hold mountain communities together. Luke positioned himself at the cabin's rear window, while Matthew approached the front door. They'd hunted together since childhood, understood each other's movements without need for words or signals. When Matthew kicked the door, splintering wood in mountain silence, Luke was already in position to catch anyone who tried to escape through the back. Carl Messer woke to the sound of his front door exploding inward, reached for the pistol he kept beside his bed, never got the chance to use it. Matthew Turner shot him through the chest as he sat up in bed, the sound echoing through a cabin that had sheltered 3 generations of Messer family. The man's wife screamed, pulled covers over her head as if fabric could protect her from violence that had invaded her home like floodwater rising beyond all previous boundaries. "Ma'am," Matthew said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "stay under them covers. Don't look. Don't move. This ain't about you." The woman stopped screaming, lay perfectly still while Matthew Turner searched her dead husband's pockets, found keys to the truck outside, confirmation that Carl Messer had helped transport stolen equipment from the Turner family hollow. Justice in these mountains was specific, targeted, reserved for people who'd made choices that violated codes older than any law written in distant courthouses. Luke moved to the second cabin while Matthew covered his approach. This target lived alone. A bachelor named Tommy Whitman, who'd helped dismantle the Turner, still in exchange for promises of steady income from expanded Moonshine operations. Tommy had miscalculated the Turner family's willingness to fight for what belonged to them, had treated their patience as weakness rather than restraint. The cabin door wasn't locked. Mountain people rarely locked doors when they trusted their neighbors to respect property and privacy. Luke entered silently, moved through darkness towards sounds of snoring that guided him to a bedroom where Tommy Whitman slept the deep sleep of a man with clear conscience. Luke stood beside the bed for 30 seconds, looking down at a neighbor he'd known since childhood, a man who'd helped his family during hard times, who'd shared meals at the Turner table, who'd been trusted with secrets and friendship, and the kind of respect that mountain people reserved for those they considered honorable. That trust had been betrayed for money, for equipment, for the chance to profit from someone else's heritage. The rifle barrel touched Tommy Whitman's forehead, cold metal against warm skin. Tommy's eyes opened, focused on Luke Turner's face, understood immediately what was happening and why. "You helped them steal our still," Luke said quietly. "Helped them take 4 generations of Turner family work. You know what that means." Tommy nodded slowly. No point in denying what both men knew to be true. No point in begging for mercy from people whose mercy had already been exhausted by theft, too complete to forgive. "Make it quick," Tommy said. Luke pulled the trigger. Tommy Whitman's head exploded against pillows that would need burning before anyone could sleep in that bed again. Another conspirator eliminated. Another name crossed off a list written in blood and mountain justice that recognized no authority except the codes that had governed these hills since the first settlers carved homes from wilderness. At the Caney Creek Bridge, Mark Turner discovered that killing wasn't as easy as his older brothers had made it appear. Billy and Frank Hackett lived in houses separated by a creek that ran clear and cold even in September drought, connected by a wooden bridge their grandfather had built during the Depression when neighbors helped neighbors and theft between families was unthinkable. Mark approached Billy Hackett's house first, moving through shadows cast by moonlight filtering through oak trees that had shaded this hollow for decades. The house sat quiet, no lights visible, family asleep and trusting in isolation to protect them from consequences they'd never imagined possible. The front door stood unlocked. Mark entered carefully, rifle ready, following sounds that led him to a bedroom where Billy Hackett slept beside his wife, their 2 young children in a smaller room across the hall. The sight of those children, innocent faces peaceful in sleep, nearly broke Mark's resolve. These weren't the faces of thieves or conspirators. These were children who'd wake tomorrow to find their father dead, and their world destroyed by violence they couldn't understand. Mountain codes were clear about children. They weren't responsible for their parents' choices, weren't legitimate targets for vengeance that should be reserved for people old enough to understand consequences. Mark stood in that hallway for 5 minutes, wrestling with training that said complete the mission and humanity that said some lines shouldn't be crossed regardless of provocation. Billy Hackett solved Mark's dilemma by waking, sensing something wrong, reaching for the rifle he kept beside his bed. Mark shot him through the chest before conscious thought could interfere with reflexes trained through years of hunting. Billy Hackett died instantly, blood spreading across sheets while his wife screamed and children cried in the next room. "Ma'am," Mark said, his voice shaking, "get your children. Get out of this house. Drive to your sister's place in Jackson. Don't come back for 3 days. Don't call the law. Don't do nothing except disappear until this is finished." The woman gathered her children, ran from the house without looking back, understanding instinctively that she'd witnessed something that could get her killed if she stayed, if she talked, if she became a problem for people willing to murder her husband in their own bedroom. Frank Hackett heard his brother's wife screaming across the creek, heard children crying, understood that whatever he'd feared was happening had finally arrived. He grabbed his shotgun, ran outside in boxer shorts and bare feet, looking toward his brother's house where dark shapes moved against yellow window light. Mark Turner shot him from the bridge, clean shot through the heart that dropped Frank Hackett in his own front yard. The man fell beside flowers his wife had planted that spring, blood-watering soil that would remember this September night, long after anyone living had forgotten the names of the dead. By midnight, 7 men were dead across 3 locations. The Turner family regrouped at a crossroads, where 4 dirt tracks met in darkness that seemed thicker than normal, as if the mountains themselves were trying to hide what was happening in these hollows. Ezekiel counted his sons, confirmed they were uninjured, listened to reports that confirmed the first phase of their operation had succeeded beyond their most optimistic expectations. 7 down, Ezekiel said. 7 more to go. We regroup, reload, finish this before dawn gives anyone time to run or call for help that might complicate what we're doing. The remaining targets were scattered across harder terrain, houses built in hollows so remote that reaching them required knowledge of trails that weren't marked on any map. These were mountain people who'd chosen isolation as protection, who trusted in distance and difficult access to keep them safe from problems that might arise from choices they'd made. They'd miscalculated the Turner family's knowledge of these mountains, their willingness to travel any distance necessary to eliminate people who'd violated codes that held their world together. Isolation that had once provided protection would now ensure that death could visit without witnesses, without interference, without anyone hearing shots that echoed through hollows, where screams would be answered only by wind moving through trees that had seen violence before and would see it again. The Turner family was learning that revenge, once begun, develops its own momentum, its own logic that makes each subsequent killing easier than the last. They were discovering that crossing the line between civilization and savagery isn't a single moment of choice, but a process that transforms ordinary people into something else entirely, step by step, shot by shot, until looking back becomes impossible, because the distance traveled has become too great to measure. At 12:17 a.m., the Turner family moved deeper into mountain darkness toward targets who believed distance and difficult terrain would protect them from consequences they'd never seriously considered. The temperature had dropped to 56 degrees, but adrenaline and purpose kept the cold at bay, as 5 men with rifles moved through forests their ancestors had walked for generations, following trails invisible to outsiders but clear as highways to people born in these hills. The 4th location sat 4 miles up a hollow so narrow that sunlight reached the bottom only at noon on the clearest days. A cabin built against a limestone cliff where Moses Fletcher had lived alone since his wife died in 1983. Moses was 62 years old, had helped plan the theft of the Turner still because he resented their family's success during times when his own Moonshine operation struggled to find buyers. He'd provided the knowledge of backtrails necessary to move heavy equipment without being seen, had coordinated timing to ensure the Turner family would be away when their heritage was stolen. Daniel and Matthew approached the cabin from opposite sides, moving with military precision, learned in wars that had taught them the value of overwhelming force applied quickly, decisively, without mercy for enemies who'd chosen their fate through actions that couldn't be forgiven. Moses Fletcher's isolation, which had once provided privacy for his own illegal activities, now ensured that his death would pass unnoticed until daylight revealed what mountain justice looked like when codes were broken by people who'd miscalculated their neighbors' willingness to fight. The cabins sat dark, except for dying embers in a fireplace that provided heat against September nights that hinted at winter coming early to these elevations. Moses Fletcher slept in a bed his grandfather had built from chestnut trees cut on this same property, trusting in solitude to protect him from vengeance that had been building since the moment the Turner family discovered their stolen legacy. Daniel entered through the front door while Matthew positioned himself at the single window that faced the hollow. Moses woke to the sound of footsteps on wooden floors that had never before been violated by uninvited presence. He reached for the pistol beside his bed, found Daniel Turner's rifle barrel pressed against his forehead before his fingers could close around the grip. "You know why we're here?" Daniel said, his voice carrying the mechanical calm of a man who'd killed before, who understood that some problems could only be solved through violence so complete it eliminated any possibility of future challenges. Moses nodded slowly. The theft of moonshine equipment wasn't random crime in these mountains. It was violation of codes that everyone understood, betrayal of trust that held isolated communities together when law enforcement was hours away, and help came only from neighbors who followed unwritten rules about property and respect. "I needed the money," Moses said quietly. "My operation wasn't bringing nothing. Couldn't pay bills, couldn't keep the cabin. I thought the Turner family had enough to share. We would have helped if you'd asked," Daniel replied. "Would have given you work, shared buyers, done what neighbors do for neighbors who find themselves in hard times. Instead, you chose theft, chose to violate trust that took decades to build." Moses Fletcher understood the logic of mountain justice, even as it was being applied to him. He'd grown up in these hills, knew the codes, understood that some violations couldn't be forgiven because forgiveness would encourage others to believe that theft could be accomplished without consequences. His death wasn't personal vengeance. It was maintenance of social order in places where social order depended on shared understanding about what crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The shot echoed through the hollow, bouncing off limestone cliffs that had heard similar sounds during feuds that marked these mountains for generations. Moses Fletcher died in the cabin where 3 generations of his family had lived, died knowing that his choice to help steal Turner family heritage had brought inevitable consequences that mountain people understood, even when they didn't like them. Luke and Mark Turner moved toward the 5th target, a man named Jesse Combs, who lived in a trailer at the end of a logging road that hadn't been maintained since the timber company abandoned it in 1982. Jesse was 54 years old, had driven one of the trucks used to transport stolen equipment from the Turner Hollow to the Hackett property. His payment had been promises of steady income from expanded moonshine operations and the chance to buy quality whiskey at prices that would allow him to resell it for significant profit. The trailer sat in a clearing surrounded by stumps from trees cut years earlier, evidence of economic activity that had moved on to forests that offered easier access and cheaper transportation. Jesse Combs had chosen this isolated location because it provided privacy for activities that required distance from curious neighbors and passing traffic. That isolation now ensured his death would pass unnoticed until someone missed him enough to make the difficult journey to check on his welfare. Luke approached from the east, while Mark covered the trailer's single exit. They'd learned coordination through years of hunting together, understood each other's movements without need for radio communication that might alert their target to danger approaching through mountain darkness. Jesse Combs slept the deep sleep of a man who believed his remoteness provided protection from consequences that seemed abstract, unlikely, manageable through distance and time. The trailer door wasn't locked. Mountain people who lived alone in isolated places rarely worried about security when they trusted their neighbors to respect property boundaries and privacy. Jesse Combs woke to the sound of his door opening, reached for the rifle beside his bed, found Luke Turner standing in his living room with a weapon already aimed at his chest. "You helped steal our still," Luke said. Drove the truck that carried 4 generations of Turner family work to people who had no right to touch it. Jesse Combs looked at Luke Turner's face, saw something there that killed hope before it could fully form. This wasn't a conversation about negotiation or explanation. This was notification that consequences had arrived for choices made months earlier, when the theft seemed like opportunity rather than violation of codes that governed mountain communities. "I needed the money," Jesse said, echoing words that had become common justification for betrayal that couldn't be justified. "Times are hard. Ain't no work available for men like me." "Times are hard for everyone," Luke replied. "Difference is, some people find honest ways to survive hard times. Others choose theft, choose to take what belongs to neighbors who trusted them." Jesse Combs understood that his death was already decided, that explanation wouldn't change outcome, that Luke Turner had come to execute mountain justice rather than discuss it. He closed his eyes, thought about mistakes that had seemed reasonable when desperation clouded judgment, when the Turner family's success bred resentment among neighbors who struggled to feed their children. The shot shattered silence that had protected this clearing for years. Jesse Combs died in the trailer where he'd planned his participation in theft that seemed like salvation but had become his destruction. Another name crossed off a list written in blood and maintained through violence that mountain people understood, even when it horrified them. The sixth target required the most dangerous approach. Roy Whitman lived in a house built into a hillside where defensive positions favored anyone inside who might be prepared for trouble. Roy was 43 years old, had served 2 tours in Vietnam, had skills that made him dangerous when cornered. He'd provided security during the Still theft, had been armed and ready to shoot anyone who discovered them moving Turner family equipment through mountain darkness. Roy Whitman's military experience meant he understood tactics, fields of fire, the importance of controlling terrain that provided advantages to defenders who knew how to use elevation and cover effectively. His house sat positioned to observe approaches from 3 directions, with the hillside behind providing both protection and escape routes that would be difficult to follow in darkness. Ezekiel decided to handle this target personally. Roy Whitman had been a soldier, deserved to be killed by another soldier who understood the codes that governed men who'd served in wars that taught lessons about honor and betrayal that couldn't be learned anywhere else. This wouldn't be assassination from distance. This would be confrontation between veterans who'd earned the right to face death with dignity reserved for people who'd already proven their courage in places where courage was measured by willingness to die for principles larger than personal survival. Ezekiel approached Roy Whitman's house at 1:43 a.m., moving with patience learned during night patrols in Korea, where hasty movement meant death for entire squads. The house showed no lights, but Ezekiel sensed alertness inside, awareness that belonged to men who'd learned to sleep lightly when enemies might be approaching through darkness that concealed movement until killing distance was reached. The front door opened before Ezekiel could knock. Roy Whitman stood silhouetted against dim interior light, rifle in his hands but not yet aimed, recognition flickering across his face as he identified his visitor. 2 veterans who'd served their country with honor, who'd come home to mountains that offered few opportunities for men trained in skills that civilian life didn't value. Ezekiel Turner, Roy said quietly. Figured you'd get here eventually. Roy Whitman. Ezekiel nodded toward the rifle in the other man's hands. You planning to use that? Roy looked at his weapon, looked at Ezekiel's face, calculated odds that included his military training against the Turner family's determination to eliminate everyone who'd participated in theft that couldn't be forgiven. He'd served with men like Ezekiel Turner, understood the difference between anger that burned hot and resolve that ran cold, deep, permanent. You came here to kill me, Roy said. Not a question, just acknowledgement of reality that both men understood. You helped steal our still, Ezekiel replied. Provided security for thieves who took 4 generations of Turner family work. Violated trust that held these mountains together when law enforcement couldn't reach and neighbors had to depend on neighbors following codes that everyone understood. Roy Whitman set his rifle aside, gesture of recognition that fighting would only delay inevitable outcome, that death was approaching regardless of his military skills or defensive advantages. Some battles couldn't be won through tactics or courage or superior firepower. Some battles were lost the moment choices were made that violated codes older than any war either man had fought. I needed the money, Roy said. Same justification every conspirator had offered, same explanation that revealed fundamental misunderstanding of what the Turner family had lost. VA benefits weren't covering medical bills. House needed repairs I couldn't afford. Seemed like the Turner family had more than they needed. We would have helped, Ezekiel said. Would have given you work, shared what we had, done what neighbors do when neighbors find themselves struggling. Instead, you chose theft. Chose to take rather than ask, to steal rather than work. Roy Whitman understood mountain logic, even as it condemned him. He'd grown up in these hills, knew the codes, understood that some violations couldn't be overlooked, because overlooking them would destroy the trust that held isolated communities together. His death wasn't personal revenge. It was maintenance of social order that depended on shared understanding about consequences that followed certain choices. "Make it quick," Roy said. Ezekiel shot him through the heart. Roy Whitman fell in his doorway, body blocking entrance to a house that had sheltered a good man who'd made bad choices during desperate times. Another veteran dead, another name crossed off a list that grew shorter with each shot fired in mountain darkness. The 7th through 10th targets lived clustered around a crossroads where 4 families had built houses within sight of each other, seeking community in isolation that made individual survival difficult during harsh winters and economic downturns that affected everyone simultaneously. These were the Messer brothers, all related to Carl Messer, who'd already died for his participation in the theft, all involved in planning and execution of the crime that had destroyed Turner family heritage. Daniel, Matthew, Luke, and Mark Turner surrounded the crossroads at 2:15 a.m., positioning themselves to control all escape routes while maintaining fields of fire that would prevent coordination between targets who might attempt organized resistance. The houses sat dark and quiet, families sleeping peacefully, trusting in numbers and kinship to provide protection that individual isolation couldn't guarantee. The Messer brothers had calculated that group solidarity would discourage retaliation, that the Turner family wouldn't risk confrontation with multiple armed men who could coordinate defense and call for help from neighbors who shared blood relationships, that created obligations stronger than abstract concepts about mountain justice. They'd miscalculated the Turner family's commitment to eliminating everyone who'd participated in theft that couldn't be forgiven, regardless of numbers or defensive advantages. The attack began simultaneously at all 4 houses. Daniel kicked down the front door of the first house while Matthew entered through the rear. Luke and Mark approached the second and third houses with coordination learned through years of hunting together. Ezekiel covered the 4th house, preventing anyone from escaping, while his sons eliminated targets, who trusted in community to provide protection that mountain justice wouldn't respect. The Messer brothers died in their beds, in their hallways, in their kitchens, where they'd gathered to drink coffee and plan their futures with money earned from stolen Turner family equipment. They died quickly, without time to coordinate resistance or call for help that wouldn't have arrived in time to matter. Their deaths were efficient, professional, executed with precision that left no doubt about the Turner family's commitment to eliminating everyone who'd violated codes that held these mountains together. By 3:30 a.m., 10 men were dead across 6 locations scattered throughout Breathitt County. The Turner family regrouped at an abandoned mine entrance where they'd hidden supplies and additional ammunition, counting their weapons, checking for injuries, confirming that the first phase of their operation had succeeded beyond their most optimistic projections. 10 down, Ezekiel said, his voice carrying satisfaction that came from seeing plans executed flawlessly under conditions that could have resulted in disaster if any detail had been overlooked. 4 more to go. We finish this before dawn gives anyone time to discover what we've done and complicate our final targets. The remaining 4 conspirators lived in locations that required different approaches, different tactics, different levels of patience and skill. These were the most dangerous targets, men who'd been selected for their intelligence and caution, rather than their willingness to participate in dangerous activities. They'd chosen remote locations specifically to avoid consequences that might arise from choices they'd made, trusting in distance and careful planning to protect them from retaliation that seemed increasingly likely as time passed, without discovery of their crime. They'd underestimated the Turner family's patience, their willingness to wait months before striking, their ability to plan operations that would eliminate all threats simultaneously before anyone could warn others or seek protection from authorities who might interfere with mountain justice that recognized no authority except codes written in blood and enforced by people who understood that some violations couldn't be forgiven. The Turner family was about to complete their transformation from victims of theft into something far more dangerous. Hunters who'd learned that protecting what belonged to them required willingness to become what their enemies feared most. 4 more men would die before sunrise, and the Turner family would have eliminated everyone who'd participated in theft that couldn't be overlooked, forgiven, or allowed to stand as precedent for future violations of codes that held mountain communities together when law enforcement couldn't reach, and neighbors had to depend on neighbors following unwritten rules about property, respect, and consequences that followed certain choices. The 11th target required a 3-mile hike through terrain so treacherous that even experienced hunters avoided it during daylight hours. A narrow ridge that connected two hollows, with drop-offs on both sides that would kill anyone who lost footing in darkness. But Jimmy Hackett had chosen this location precisely because it was nearly inaccessible, trusting in geography to protect him from consequences he'd calculated were unlikely but possible. Jimmy was Earl Hackett's nephew, 38 years old, had served as lookout during the Still theft, positioned on high ground where he could spot anyone approaching, while his relatives and their conspirators dismantled 4 generations of Turner family heritage. His role had been crucial to the operation's success, his knowledge of mountain terrain invaluable for planning escape routes if discovery threatened their carefully orchestrated crime. Luke and Mark Turner made the climb together, moving with patience learned through decades of hunting in mountains that punished hasty movement with broken bones or worse. The trail wasn't marked on any map, existed only in the collective memory of families who'd walked these ridges for generations, passing knowledge from father to son about paths that connected isolated homesteads to the outside world. The ridge was barely 6 feet wide at its narrowest point, with limestone cliffs dropping 300 feet into darkness, so complete that thrown stones would fall in silence until they struck bottom. Mountain fog drifted up from the hollows below, creating visibility that changed moment by moment as wind patterns shifted clouds that seemed solid enough to walk on. Jimmy Hackett's cabin sat perched on a narrow shelf carved from the mountainside, accessible only by following the ridge to its terminus, where a switchback trail descended 20 feet to the building site. The cabin itself was small, 2 rooms and a porch that faced east towards sunrise that would reveal the Cumberland Mountains stretching to the horizon like frozen waves in an ocean of stone. Luke positioned himself above the cabin while Mark approached from below, using handholds carved by Jimmy Hackett himself during construction that had required hauling materials up the same treacherous path the Turner brothers now followed. The coordination was silent, communicated through hand signals learned during years of hunting, together in mountains where noise could alert prey to danger approaching through forest that amplified sound in unpredictable ways. Jimmy Hackett wasn't sleeping. He sat on his porch with a rifle across his knees, watching darkness that might conceal approaching death, listening to mountain silence that had become oppressive rather than peaceful. His military instincts, learned during 2 tours in Vietnam, told him that isolation, which had once provided protection, might now trap him in a location where escape would be impossible if enemies approached with sufficient determination. He saw Luke Turner moving along the ridge above his cabin, recognized the purposeful movement that separated hunters from prey, understood that his calculation about geography providing protection had been fatally flawed. The Turner family knew these mountains as well as any family that had ever walked them, possessed knowledge passed down through generations about trails and paths that weren't marked on government maps. Jimmy raised his rifle, aimed at Luke's silhouette against sky that was beginning to show the faintest suggestion of grey. His finger tightened on the trigger, hesitated as training reminded him that muzzle flash would reveal his position to other enemies who might be approaching from different directions, that shooting one Turner brother might only ensure his death would be slower, more painful than if he accepted what was coming. Mark Turner appeared below the cabin, rifle aimed upward, eliminating any possibility of escape toward the valley floor. Jimmy Hackett found himself trapped between 2 armed men on terrain that offered no cover, no concealment, no tactical advantage that might allow him to survive confrontation with people who'd already proven their willingness to kill systematically, professionally, without mercy for enemies who'd chosen their fate through actions that violated codes older than any law. "You helped them steal our still," Luke called from the ridge above. "Provided security while they took 4 generations of Turner family work." "I needed the money," Jimmy replied, his voice carrying across mountain air that seemed to amplify sound while distorting direction. Same justification that had been offered by every conspirator. same explanation that revealed fundamental misunderstanding of what they'd stolen. "You could have asked for help," Mark said from below. "Could have come to us when times got hard, when you needed work or money or assistance that neighbors provide for neighbors who find themselves struggling." Jimmy Hackett understood the logic, but couldn't accept it, couldn't reconcile his desperate circumstances with pride that prevented him from admitting failure to neighbors who'd achieved success through methods he'd never fully understood. The Turner family's prosperity during times when other mountain families struggled had bred resentment that made theft seem like justice rather than crime. The shots came simultaneously from above and below, crossfire that eliminated any possibility of survival for a man caught between enemies who'd planned their attack with military precision. Jimmy Hackett fell on the porch, where he'd spent countless evenings watching sunset paint the mountains, in colors that changed with seasons, with weather, with light that revealed beauty in landscape that could kill the unprepared, the unwary, the unlucky. Another name crossed off a list that was rapidly approaching completion. Another conspirator eliminated. Another violation of mountain codes answered with violence that restored balance to communities where balance depended on shared understanding about consequences that followed certain choices. The 12th target lived in a houseboat moored on a section of the Kentucky River, so remote that visitors arrived only by water or by hiking trails that required local knowledge to navigate successfully. Bobby Jean Morrison had participated in the still theft because he possessed the mechanical skills necessary to dismantle and reassemble complex distillery equipment without damaging components that couldn't be replaced. The houseboat provided isolation that Bobby Jean believed would protect him from retaliation that seemed increasingly likely as weeks passed without discovery of the crime. He could disappear into river systems that connected to the Ohio, could navigate waterways that law enforcement rarely patrolled, could vanish into a network of backwater channels where wanted men had hidden from authority for generations. Daniel and Matthew Turner approached by water, using a john boat with a motor muffled to reduce sound that might alert their target to danger approaching through darkness that concealed movement until killing distance was reached. The river ran high despite September drought, fed by springs that maintained flow even during dry seasons that turned creek beds to dust and gravel. The Turner family's night of vengeance ended as dawn broke over the Cumberland Mountains. 14 men eliminated across Breathitt County in a single coordinated operation that would be remembered as the most systematic family massacre in Appalachian history. But their victory was hollow, their heritage still stolen, their legacy now forever stained with blood that no amount of mountain justice could wash clean. Sometimes protecting what you love requires becoming something you can never forgive yourself for being. The Turners' still was never recovered, lost forever in the violence that consumed both victims and perpetrators alike.